Nolan, why did I ever doubt you? I just saw the Odyssey. Let's talk about it. So first thing I want to point out about this movie is it just feels so larger than life. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that this movie was shot entirely on IMAX, which I do think contributes to the overall scale of the film. And that is definitely something it does a great job with, is making everything seem large and vast and like this giant world that we all live in. And speaking of the world, it felt very lived in and it felt very gritty, which is always something I appreciate, especially in entertainment. These are characters that have existed, these are locations that have existed, and we are just being thrown right into the middle of the story. It feels like you're not just watching Odysseus's journey, but that you're on the journey with him. And I think that was so cool to experience. So first thing I wanted to acknowledge is the soundtrack, which was composed by the GOAT, Ludwig Göransson. Now, I will say the soundtrack wasn't used heavily in the movie. It wasn't exactly very prominent, but when it was used in the movie, it was used really well and in a way that really elevated the scene. So let's talk about the cast. So we have our leading man, Matt Damon, as Odysseus. I think this is probably his best performance. He is absolutely fantastic as Odysseus. He brings so much grit. He also very well portrays the conflicts of being a leader and being a father and a husband, and he just really gave his all to this character. Playing his son Telemachus is Tom Holland, who also gives a very admirable performance. I saw Tom Holland act in a way in some of these scenes that I've never seen before. Anne Hathaway as Penelope, I think if anything, she did a great job portraying the pain and suffering that Penelope faced in Odysseus's absence. We got our boy Robert Pattinson. Robert Pattinson is just phenomenal. I mean, the range of this man. He does a great job playing a sneaky, slimy villain. I also wanted to talk about Benny Safdie as Agamemnon. Let me tell you something about Agamemnon in this movie. Now, I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think he ever talks in the movie. Maybe he has a line here or there, but if I remember correctly, I don't think he ever talks. But he has so much aura in this movie. Whenever Agamemnon is in the scene, is on the screen in this movie, he just stands out above all the rest. There's one scene in particular where they show the invasion of Troy, and Odysseus and his men invade by using the Trojan horse, and they finally get the doors open. You just see this army of silhouettes of soldiers standing outside the gates, and standing looks like about 10 feet tall above everyone else is Agamemnon. And the way he carries himself and the way they designed his helmet and his costume and his cape, he almost gave this vibe of like Darth Vader. He just had this really powerful presence to him. Next, I wanted to talk about the Cyclops scene. This was a very cool scene, very terrifying. I was really looking forward to seeing how this scene would play out. But I think the look of the Cyclops was very interesting because it didn't really look like a monster necessarily. You know, he didn't have like, you know, horns coming out of him or any kind of defining feature that looked monstrous. He looked more like just a deformed human. And also the sound design for the roar of the Cyclops was absolutely insane and absolutely terrifying. And when you think about it, if you were actually in that cave and if the rock was over the entrance and that Cyclops were to roar with nowhere for that sound to go, it would be so freaking loud. And I think they did a great job portraying that in the movie. There's also a great moment where Odysseus and his soldiers find out that the Cyclops can speak. And one of the soldiers turns to Odysseus and is like, wait, he can talk? And he's like, well, why hasn't he talked to us? And Odysseus responds with, do you talk to ants? And I thought that was such a witty moment and such a clever moment. Another great scene was the scene with Circe. So Circe, in the poem, in the book, the Odyssey, is of course one of the gods, but she is being portrayed in human form in this case. Now, let me just say, I had no idea about this part of the Odyssey. I had not read the Odyssey prior to seeing this movie, so I had no idea this scene was coming. And oh my gosh, when all the soldiers were just stuffing their face with food, I was like, I know something bad is gonna happen, but I just don't know what is gonna happen. And then when she starts turning them all into pigs, the way that was portrayed, I think Nolan did such a fantastic job. It was borderline a horror movie. I mean, he could have easily done it the easy way, played it safe, and you know, she pulls out a wand, waves it around, and casts a spell, and they just snap and turn into pigs. But no, I mean, it was like a potter with clay. She was twisting and turning their faces to be molded into looking like pigs. It was creepy as shit. And just the idea that the meat in the stew that the soldiers were eating were basically the remains of the men that had come before them, who Circe had cursed into animals, was really horrifying. But I think this scene really speaks a lot to possibly the indulgences of humans and of men in particular in this case. And it also speaks to how, you know, Circe, as a god in this case, in this story, about how she views men as basically animals. She sees their sin and she sees their instincts and she sees the way that they treat other people. So she sees man's true form as swine, as animals, which is why it was really interesting in that scene when Odysseus basically convinces her to turn his men back into humans, and as she's doing so, she says, go back to your disguises. Next, I wanted to talk about the siren scene, who are perched and laid out on these rocks kind of in the middle of the water, and as boats pass by, they basically lure in sailors with their songs, basically leading them to their death. Now, I think it was really cool how Nolan did this scene, because we were kind of put in the same shoes as Odysseus's men, because Odysseus was the only one who actually heard the siren song, because all of his men covered their ears with wax, but he specifically asked to be tied to the mast and chose not to put wax in his ears so that he could hear the siren song. And I thought the sound design was really cool, because once the last soldier put his wax in his ears and did it one ear at a time, the sound cut out. And as we saw in the scene, you know, some of the men just couldn't resist, and they took out the wax and jumped out of the boat, and I mean, it led to their death. And it just really speaks a lot to, I think, the temptation that we face as, you know, not just men, but as just humans in general. The lust and the desire for things that we can't have, or the things that we can't be. I was a little underwhelmed by this scene. I was kind of hoping it would play out more like how they did it in Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, it was set at night, and you were really kind of lured in as an audience by the mermaids, by their beauty and by their kindness. But then they turned into these monstrous creatures, and, you know, they were like leaping over the boat and grabbing sailors and drowning them. And like, I don't know, I just feel like it kind of played out in a more exciting way in Pirates of the Caribbean. But I do think Nolan had a very interesting take on the sirens. So something that we saw a lot in the promo for this movie was, of course, the giants in the armor. Now listen, I thought this scene was cool, and it is accurate to the book. It's accurate to the Odyssey. However, I do think it was a little unnecessary to the movie. It could have been cut from the movie. I don't really think it added very much. I mean, again, it was cool, and it made for some really dope-ass posters. And it was a really brutal scene, but I just don't really feel like it contributed very much to the movie as a whole. I think above all else, this movie really just portrayed the flaws of man and what makes us human. The thirst for power and control and the regret that can sometimes bring about. You know, we see this in the way the invasion of Troy is portrayed in this movie, because it's portrayed in two different ways. The first time we see the invasion of Troy, it's seen as a very victorious moment and as this great win for Odysseus and his men. But the second time that we see the invasion of Troy, it's portrayed as very tragic and brutal and just like innocent slaughter, and we kind of see it through Odysseus's perspective. And it reminded me a lot of Oppenheimer in that sense of like, once Oppenheimer had created the bomb and it had been used, you know, there was a lot of praise and a lot of victory at first, but then once he kind of settled in and kind of realized what he had created, he was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? And we see a lot of that in Odysseus as well. And that's something that I love about Odysseus's character and how he's portrayed in this movie is he's not exactly seen as a hero, but simply as an imperfect man trying to right his wrongs, which is part of what makes him such a compelling and relatable character. This movie talks a lot about Zeus's law. And basically, Zeus's law is a lot like the golden rule. You know, treat others as you wish to be treated, welcome even strangers with compassion and respect. Now, the poem, the book's reasoning for all of this is that even a beggar could be a god in disguise. So you should treat even the lowest of the low with the utmost respect. And the gods are portrayed in different ways in this movie that I think are really interesting. You know, some of the gods are seen as invisible. You know, gods like Zeus, you know, we see him in the lightning, and gods like Poseidon, we see him in the waves and in the sea. But then we see gods in human form in this movie. You know, gods like Athena, played by Zendaya, who basically acts as almost Odysseus's moral compass, almost as like his guilty conscience. And also the god Calypso is seen in human form. And as mentioned before, Circe is also seen in human form. And so it is this interesting thing of like, yeah, in the case of this story, you really don't know how a god is going to be presented to you. This movie does speak a lot on respecting the dead and those who have made sacrifices. In the case of Odysseus, you know, we see this a lot in the Hades scene in this movie. I think Hades was portrayed in a very interesting way because, you know, I was expecting, you know, more fire and brimstone kind of thing. But Hades is just this vast land of nothing, basically. Until, of course, we see the dead, you know, rise from the dirt, literally. And I think just the overall aesthetic and the overall vibe of that scene was just really cool. But overall, the movie just, it really centers on family. It centers on justice and determination. And a lot of this is seen conveyed through the character of Odysseus himself. Now, to be fair, I did want to talk about some things that I didn't really care for in the movie, that I didn't really like. So the fact that everyone kind of spoke in an American accent was a little jarring from time to time. You know, especially the fact that you had English actors in this movie who didn't speak in their regular accent, in their normal accent. If everyone, say, you know, spoke in a British accent, I do think it would have kind of added to more of the escapism of the movie and kind of, you know, taking you to a different place in that sense. I do think the dialogue felt a little too contemporary at times. There was one moment when Odysseus's men first walk into the Cyclops' cave. and they're kind of looking around, and you hear one of the soldiers say, "Do they make cheese?" Now, when my brother and I left the theater, he was like, "Now, am I crazy, or did that soldier say, 'Dude, they make cheese'? Like, dude, they make cheese?" Like, but I was like, I think he said, "Do they make cheese?" Now, I could be wrong, but I I would find it very, very, very bold of Nolan to actually have had that soldier say "dude." But I don't think he did. But I think part of the reason why a lot of the dialogue felt contemporary is just to make it more digestible for a modern audience. I also felt that some of the costumes from time to time looked a little too modern. Now, for the most part, I think the costume design was good, but there were just certain scenes where I would see certain costume elements, and I'd be like, that looks a little too much like a pair of tennis shoes, or that looks a little much like a t-shirt. Something else I didn't really care for in this movie was it did tend to feel a little repetitive, in the sense that, you know, when Odysseus is on his journey home, you know, they would see land and they would go to that land, and then they would find something scary, and then they would run from that land, and then they would find another island and find something scary on that island, and then run from that island. It was just a lot of it was a lot of that. But having said that, I mean, that's how the book is. And so I don't necessarily fault Nolan for that, because I mean, he's just telling the story, and that's what happens in the story. Odysseus is the king of side quests. And listen, I have to address it because it caused a lot of discourse online, and really got people up in arms about some of the casting. Even if you did have an issue with the casting, it's not a big enough deal. It's not a big enough problem that would overshadow how good this movie actually is. And dude, I would say the last like 30 minutes or so of the movie, where Odysseus has returned home, he passes Penelope's test, and once he shoots the guy in the neck, dude, from that point on, I mean, oh my gosh, it is 100%. It is full adrenaline rush. I love the soundtrack in this scene, because the tempo increases as the scene goes on, and it's just Odysseus and Telemachus against all of the suitors in the house, and they're just going to town, man, and it is just like the coolest thing ever. So overall, don't listen to the hate, don't listen to the naysayers. This movie is incredible. Nolan gave his all. The cast gave their all, the crew gave their all, and created something really epic, really poetic, and told an amazing story. So there you have it, guys. That is my review of Chris Nolan's The Odyssey. If you saw the movie, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to see what you guys have to say about it. Thank you guys for watching. Please be sure to give the video a like and subscribe. Hope to see you guys on the next one. And as always, catch you later.